Caprivi, land of the river god, the Kawando, the Chobe, the Kavango, and this one, the Zambezi. For more than a decade, the watershed between black Africa and white, on the fringe of an increasingly hostile continent. For South Africans serving in a territory, it's a river that needs to be watched. For not very long ago, it formed a major access route for terrorists coming in from Zambia and further afield, most of them intent on fostering revolution into southern Africa. Few locals have forgotten that for 6 years, Caprivi was a battleground. Now small patrols do the work that big ones did a decade ago, just as effectively, using the river to the same advantage as did the adversaries of an earlier period. Speak to them and they will tell you the ambience is not an unpleasant one. The boundaries of 4 countries come together in the middle of the Zambezi River, just about there. To the north, you've got Zambia. On the south bank, you've got Botswana, and further to the east, Zimbabwe. And we are standing on Caprivi soil, part of Southwest Africa and Namibia. This particular position is heavily fortified. It's been mortared on several occasions from both sides, but the South Africans stay. The only means of communication across this river is a ferry boat that runs from that point in Zambia, behind these bushes, onto Botswana. It's a major international link, with a ferry boat running fairly routinely several times a day. On the Zambian bank there's a fair deal of activity, most of it commercial, or ostensibly so. The Botswana Defence Force isn't nearly as discreet about its military installations. Kakumba Island, South Africa's furthest based east on Caprivi soil, is a compact little military unit that has already given an account of itself militarily in the past year. Some of these men regard it as one of the most pleasant and at the same time most isolated postings in the region, with little more than bush and river for company. The unit even has its occasional line that comes across the river from Botswana. Focal point of activity, though, is the observation post that tells the South Africans what is happening across the way. Defences are there, aplenty, for when the other side opened fire on Kakumba a few months ago, these were the weapons that answered in kind. The biggest South African military base in the region stands at Impalela Island, another Defence Force installation that has taken incoming fire. A mortar shell not long ago scored a direct hit on the tower. Again, the South Africans answered with a kind of aplomb that makes others think twice about doing this sort of thing too often. Life in the camp is largely easygoing and uncomplicated, with the men adapting quickly to circumstances. For many, the only diversion from routine is physical. Impalela has its own pool and volleyball court, and competition between teams sometimes fringes on frenzy. The trivia of yesterday's units that spent time at the island is much in evidence. So is base routine, which starts long before dawn each day. The accent is very definitely on self-sufficiency, using solar power for heating and the unit's very elaborate defense structure for protection, even though most will admit that things have been quiet of late. But Caprivi is not entirely orientated to conflict. Perhaps because of its troubles, which resulted in the military authority taking control in 1973, the territory in the interior remains one of the world's last great animal retreats. The diversity of game southwards towards Linyanti, Liambisi, and Nkaza Island, north of the Okavango region of Botswana, can be astonishing. The region contains some of the largest concentrations of red lechwe, as well as isolated pockets of the rare Setatunga, still to be found in Africa. Just about every great animal species in Africa can be found in abundance in Caprivi swamps, which spontaneous combustion sometimes causes to burn furiously during the hot months. There are probably enough hippo and elephant to populate all the world's zoos dozens of times over. There is also the giant Leambezi Lake, a relatively new development in Caprivi which followed the worst rains this century in 1956 and flooded an area the size of some small countries. It's interesting that one of the effects Leambezi has had on the people of the region is to change them from a meat to a fish-eating society. For the white man, the soul of Caprivi is to be found at Shukmansberg, a tiny settlement on the banks of the Zambezi. For there is more to this untidy collection of huts than initial impressions lead one to believe. Almost 75 years ago, in 1909, the Germans settled this town of Shukmansberg on the Zambezi. It was the furthest point east that was penetrated by Imperial Germany, and today little of the original settlement remains excepting for this old house. It was one of three that was built, and this one was used as a jail by the Germans. The village itself is fairly dilapidated. The other two houses have fallen into disrepair. The South Africans have added their contribution by building several structures here, including that clinic over there, which is the biggest structure of its kind for several kilometers on both sides of the river. Life in Shukmansberg remains very much what it has always been. Its pace dictated as much by heat as by the mosquitoes, which sweep in with a fury after dark. Except when the local Prime Minister and Ngambela arrives for his monthly indaba or meeting with locals. On this occasion, the young Ngambela set out with representatives of the army. Much of the music in the territory has strong religious connotations. In effect, this dance by youngsters from the local school is a prayer. Look carefully. With all the elders gathered, the time for discussion begins. It can be a very formal affair indeed. The translator interprets for the local commander, Colonel Gert Opperman. Arrivals are heralded by a clapping of hands. So is every statement made. Everyone has their say, and each proposal must be followed by an answer. The pecking order is traditional, for while the leaders of this tiny nation might affect the manners and dress of the contemporary West, their traditions are as old as some of ours. It's left to a senior headman to bring the meeting to a close, and then the army's work starts in earnest. The young Ngambela on tour is usually accompanied by a number of Defence Force specialist personnel, a vet, a doctor or two battling river disease, an eye malady that is endemic in the region, or a dentist, the most valuable man in the column. He has enough work for a dozen tours of duty. This particular lady wanted a tooth extracted. An elder interpreted the procedure, and he went ahead. Medics, meanwhile, were active with trunks full of pills and remedies. But the village is not composed entirely of locals. Mr. Gifted Chunga here is a Swapo terrorist who surrendered to the security forces. He went to Zambia to train as a terrorist in 1978 and apparently became disillusioned because the Caprivians were discriminated against. You found conditions on the other side not what you expected. Can you give us some indication of what it was like in the camp where you were staying before you ran away?
We tried to give the interviews to the members, to the big members of SOCA, but they refused to to understand what we mean. That's why we deserted in Nyango camp.
Did they threaten you with violence?
Yes.
In which way?
They always take everybody off us, off Subias. One in the truck to go and kill him.
They wanted to kill them?
Yes.
And that's why you came back here?
That's why we deserted in Nyango.
And who did you report to when you came back to Caprivi? To the army?
We reported to the police station. We were at the police station there.
Now, what are you going to do that you're back in Namibia now? Are you going to join the army? Are you going to go to 701 Battalion?
I'm going to join the army.
You're not tired of war yet?
I'm not tired. I'm not tired.
Life for an army on safari with one of the region's tribal heads can also provide a little insight to what conditions were like before the war, when much of Africa remained impervious to stresses that beset other corners of the globe. It was a graceful, easygoing period, still captured occasionally along one of the great rivers of a turbulent continent. The bush provided many of our needs, and base camp back at Katima the rest. And when we slept, eventually, it was to a symphony of the African night, punctuated occasionally by drums from Zambia across the way. Katima Malilo, the Caprivi capital, is not a big town, even by African standards. Situated anywhere else in the world, it would probably barely have rated a mention. Still, it's the principal settlement of the region, the proverbial melting pot of Caprivi's two main tribes, the Mafwi, who live principally in the west, and the Basubia of the east. Ties with Zambia are close. Close enough at any rate for this man to have been wearing the UNIP Zambian party tie. For it's true that while economic conditions in Zambia remain depressed, many villages in the south of the neighboring territory regularly cross into Caprivi to buy essentials, beer included. Katima Malilo is characterized, in southern Africa at any rate, by its bunkers, the sort that protect locals against enemy mortar and rocket bombardments. The town has come under attack from across the river in the past, and with civilian personnel forming a large proportion of the settlement's population, no one is taking chances. Every house in Katima has its own shelter, which sometimes forms a useful adjunct to the local playpen. Life for the women of the town follows a traditional Afrikaner pattern, with Bible readings for those interested coming to the fore several times a week. For the children, the place is a tropical paradise. Considering the climate, the amount of sport achieved in the soporific heat can only be described with a certain amount of detachment. Katima has its own tennis club, extremely active fishing and boating clubs, and several rugby teams, composed mainly of men from the various units stationed there. They take their sport seriously. The Katima Cup is one of the most hotly contested events of the year. Economically, the region would be in the doldrums were it not for the incredible abundance of tropical hardwoods. The authorities built the sawmill, and much of its output today finds its way to the railhead at Grootfontein, a day or more by road to the west. There is no doubt that the social face of Caprivi is changing, as it has in other parts of Africa. That many of the old customs remain, as entrenched as the system which spawned them. One of these is the traditional method of sawing wood, one man on top of a log, the other in a hole in the ground below. The work is difficult, and in that heat innovating, but it does have its following in the interior, motivated no doubt by the fact that the current market value of one of these planks of kiat, and there are about a dozen to a log this size, will bring these two men 40 rand each. The village nearby is no different to hundreds of other Caprivi settlements in the interior. Children are there in abundance, so are the elders. But the big event of the week is still beer, brewed in this part of the country in 44-gallon drums. The war in Caprivi started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the 18th of May 1967. It was an attack on the river by Swapo terrorists that had come across from the other side. And Mr. Leonard Chaka here was involved in that skirmish. A policeman who was doing patrol work, searching one of the boats, and as a result of that action, he is blind. He was shot in the head, and he has very bad wound in the arm. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that episode.
Yes. Because he went on the passenger barge at Sheke Boma here. So we have already noticed that this man will be moving with this passenger barge.
And did you know he was armed?
Yes.
So he didn't take you completely by surprise?
No, because we were trying to do our job. Because we got information that he's going back to Lusaka.
To Zambia?
Yes, to take a big weapons. So that when he comes back, then he will come and attack Caprivi.
And who was he?
He was Tobias Hanyeko.
A member of SWAPO?
Yes, he was a general in SWAPO.
A general in SWAPO?
Yeah.
Now, why don't you want SWAPO in this area? Because you are obviously one of the headmen, and what you say...
The enemy to everybody in Caprivi.
Can you explain to me why?
The reason why I call them enemy, because whatever they come and they can just come and kill these innocent people. Because this thing is happening in Southwest, we can hear.
You have seen it happen?
No, I just listen, or I always listen to the radios, what they are doing in Southwest. They can easily come and do the same here. You can see I was not born like this. It's because of SWAPO.
The Zambia mentioned by Mr. Leonard Chaka is indeed just across the way from Katima. And you don't need to climb the tallest building to get a very good view of it either. For its part, Katima could be 1,000 kilometers from the operational area. For the pace of life in the main military base is far less intense than it is in Evombo, a good few hours flying time to the west. Yet the security forces in the area have a role to play. Even the most sanguine observer accepts that were the South Africans to pull out tomorrow, their presence would be replaced within a week by that of SWAPO. So the patrols go on, like this one on the roads. Others are on foot in the bush. The South African police are also active. They and their Southwest African counterparts run a fairly substantial training base at this camp just outside Katima. There's nothing subtle about the training. These men are being prepared for the kind of problems which beset the Caprivi not very long ago.
At your own target, in your own time. Fire!
In bushcraft, counteraction and patrols, these men are taught to be equally adept should they find themselves in a tight spot. For there are no half measures in any kind of insurgency conflict.
Forward!
River patrols such as this one are equally real. Though since 10 South African soldiers were killed at Katima in a rocket attack from the Zambian side in 1978, which resulted in a more aggressive policy by the South African government of taking the war to the enemy, incursions have been few and largely desultory. But to paraphrase von Clausewitz, even the SAP acknowledges that to have peace you need to prepare for conflict, whatever the level of intensity. As with other ethnic groups in Southwest Africa, Caprivi has its own battalion, 701, some of whose members have already distinguished themselves in action against SWAPO in cross-border raids into Angola.
.135 and 134.
The recruiting process goes on intermittently throughout the year, and judging by the reaction when we were there, supply outstripped demand by something like 10 to 1. The battalion was looking for about 70 good men. There were almost 700 applications for these positions last December. In order literally to separate the men from the boys, all applicants were required to pass a fairly stiff selection course, like this one involving a run of 10 kilometers with 20 kilos of bricks and a canvas pack. In heat which touched 30 degrees Celsius in the shade, the potential recruits went to it with a gusto of professionals. Not everybody finished. The number 39 here came in first.
Number?
79.
These were the first dozen to come in. And if they fare as well in other tests, they will be fighting men within a year, though some, in their enthusiasm to win through, will carry the occasional scar to prove their perseverance. Caprivi Battalion Omana have proved their mettle more than once. Their assault course is equivalent to anything experienced by South African troopies under training. Smart, aggressive, willing, they know the pace and what is expected of them.
Okay, come down the rope now. Keep going.
Before we arrived, these men had been practicing all morning, but they had no compunction in completing the route once more for our benefit. Apparently the course is a cinch for someone in reasonable physical condition. It's the snakes in some of the tunnels they have to crawl through that present real problems. In the final phase of training, this assault course is completed with live ammunition being fired over the heads of participants. Apparently, then the course is finished in about half the time it takes in routine training. It doesn't take long to establish traditions. It's maintaining them that matters most. Mapacho Base is the Air Force counterpart to the Army establishment at Katima, lying about 30 kilometers into the interior of the territory. And whereas the executive establishment in Ovombo is largely dominated by men, Caprivi has seen its first operational females, so it's not all that surprising therefore to see an army vehicle approach a roadblock, like this one, and to find the cab shared by a baby in a pram. Captain Rowena Pienaar here has been in the South African Air Force for 5.5 years. At the moment, she is the adjutant officer at Mapacho Air Force Base, which is the biggest operational Air Force base in Caprivi. How long have you been up here now?
I've been up for just about 3 months.
And how long will you stay on this particular assignment?
Until the end of August next year. It'll be just about a year.
Doesn't it worry you living so close to Zambia, because the area has had its problems?
No, it's just part of the job.
Corporal Geraldine Tata is one of the George girls who's found herself in the operational area. She's a corporal here at this Air Force base and has been here for 4 months. How long do you think you'll still stay?
Up until 83.
And do you think you'll make a career of your life in the Air Force now that you're in?
Yes, I love it.
How do you manage to fit in, being one of the few girls in a huge military area where there are mainly men predominant?
Well, you get accustomed to it. You're just one of them.
And you are married as well?
Yes, I'm married.
Running a home in a place like Caprivi where there are very few shops, there are necessities for the home that you need that you can't get locally. How do you overcome this problem?
When you want something very bad and you need it, then you can go down by aeroplane to...
By military transport?
Yes, to the Republic and buy them and then you can come back.
Do you do this on occasion?
Yes.
And then once a year you go and leave with your family?
Yes, we go down to there.
Something to look forward to?
Yes.
In the past, one of the most active camps militarily in the Caprivi was this one at Wanela, west of Katima town. It not only lies within shouting distance of Zambian positions, but boasts the only military establishment in southern Africa with a resident herd of about 50 elephant, who make a ritual of strolling past the camp to water the river each evening. Not at all intimidated by kilometers of barbed wire strung across the frontier, or the heavy defenses which line the bunkers, the lack of hostile action has probably caused them to prefer an area close to man. It could be that these great beasts are aware that a poacher's shot could bring a security patrol running. All activity on the Zambezi River is closely monitored at this point, as it probably is from the Zambian side as well, that the troops do take time off for some of the best tiger fishing available along the entire frontier region. For the troops stationed there, the routine follows the usual pattern: letters, home, or a couple of hours on watch.
7 women.
You only need to glance at the honors roll to see that this can be a serious business.
Gentlemen, we've been here before. We're here until the beginning of February. Gentlemen, I'll give you the jobs. Jobs.
Cheers.
Cheers. Boss. Oh, when
And then, when it's all over, there is still a reason why our boys spend time away from home. For Caprivi remains an operational area along our borders, though granted, not an active one. Still, there are men needed on the ground, for machines in this electronic age can only do so much. Soldiers with gun in their hands are still needed to trudge through an often unfriendly bush. And if this patrol doesn't find a contact, perhaps the next one will, or the one after that. In Caprivi, only one thing is certain. SWAPO may not be active today. It's tomorrow that these men are concerned about.